Today's lesson is on romanization. Now, romanization is one of those things we try to avoid in language class. We always try and teach students their kana very quickly so that we don't have to mess with romanization. But in the case of bibliography, romanization is sort of a necessary evil. If you're searching a database that requires romanization, then you're going to have to know how to do it. And if you're writing a paper and the paper is written for folks who can't read Japanese, you're going to have to romanize titles. So there's all kinds of reasons why romanization has to be included in a course like this. Now I'm going to start by mentioning that there are two basic systems, sort of largely recognized systems of romanization in Japanese studies. The first one is called the Hepburn system, and it's named for a person named Hepburn, and it dates back to 1885. Generally speaking, the Hepburn system is based on how words sound, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that in just a minute. The other system, it's called the Kunde system, and that dates to 1937. This is a modified version of the Nippon Shiki, which dates to 1885. So both of these systems really go back to the middle of the Meiji period. The Kunde system, or the Nippon Shiki system, is based on how words are spelled in kana. And again, I'm going to explain what I mean by that on subsequent slides. So in either case, the systems rely on an American English pronunciation. A lot of us sort of just take this for granted. We don't even think about it. But I want to give you some samples of what it would be like if these systems were based on some other Romanized language, some other European language. For example, what if romanization were based on German writing? Well, then maybe Yokohama would be written with a J instead of a Y, because in German that J is a Y sound, not a J sound. Or Choshi might be written TSCH instead of just CH. I know it looks crazy, but think about it. How about Ichinomiya? Again, that TSCH sound and the J sound would be different. Just like Hojo might be spelled with a couple extra consonants thrown in. We're not doing that. We're basing things on English. One more example for you. What if it were French instead of English? Well, if it were French instead of English, then maybe Fujiyama would look like this. Or Tokushima might look like this. And Shogun might look something like this. I know they look really nutty. I actually got these examples from a book on romanization that was published in the third year of Taisho that's available on the National Diet Library website. I didn't make these up. So if you have any issues about how I'm romanizing German or French, then you can take it up with the authors of that book. All right. So I was mentioning how we had the difference between how something sounds and how something is spelled. And so now I need to introduce something you probably already know, but you didn't know what it was called, and that's the Goju Onzu. Goju as in 50, Onzu, a chart of sounds. The Goju Onzu is based actually on a Sanskrit model going back to the continent. And that goes pretty far back into Japanese history. Even when the orthography, which we haven't looked at yet, but we will soon, changed in 1945, the Goju Onzu didn't really change much. So here's the Goju Onzu. This should look familiar to you. Maybe you've seen it rotated, but in general, this is a chart that you find in most Japanese language textbooks. And in this case, it starts on the right-hand side and is usually read out loud like this. A, I, U, E, O, Ka, Ki, Ku, Ke, Ko, Sa, Shi, Su, Se, So. Okay, so it's specifically that order. It's always that order. You're looking in a Japanese dictionary. This is what you might think of as almost alphabetical order, even though we're not dealing with an alphabet, we're dealing with the kana. And over here on the left-hand side, we've got a couple things in parentheses. We'll talk more about that in our subsequent unit about simplification. But suffice it to say, ideally, the Japanese think of their language as having 50, more or less, 50 sounds. Plus, of course, that n here. That n's a kind of a new development, too. We'll get to that when we get to simplification. Okay, so this is the Goju Onzu. Every time I refer to the Goju Onzu, this is what you should be thinking about. Here's another version of the Goju Onzu in which I have the romanization for all of the kana. This particular chart is the Hepburn system. And I'm going to say more about Hepburn, and then we're going to take a look at the other system, the Kunene system. But one of the other things that I want to point out here is that when Japanese talk about the Goju Onzu, they speak of the gyo, this kanji right here. You're thinking, oh, that's iku or yuku, which it is, to go. But gyo can also mean a column. So people will speak about the agyo, the kagyo, the sagyo. So they're talking about the a column, the ka column, the sa column. They don't refer to it, for example, as the K or the S or the T because they're thinking in Japanese. You can't say those consonants separately. So that's terminology that I wanted to introduce. And then the rows are referred to as dan. This kanji is pronounced dan. It means a level. So this is the adan, the idan, the udan. And I think it's pretty easy to see what's happening here. So in the agyo and the adan, we have a. These are all the pure vowels. And then over here, we start adding consonants. So in the kagyo, it's ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. We're adding these vowels as we go down. So this is the Hepburn system. And you'll notice, when you look at this, that most of the kana in the Hepburn system are represented by 2 Roman letters, but not all of them. For example, here, chi, that's represented by 3. This one, shi, represented by 3 letters. Tsu, further on down, represented by 3 letters. Why is that? Because the Hepburn system, remember what I was saying, is based on how things sound. Okay? So Hepburn heard the sound chi, and he thought, well, that sounds like a CHI to me. That's how it'll be romanized in my system. Now, when we look at the Kunene Shiki, you'll see how that differs. Okay? All right, so first of all, let's continue on here. Here's the Hepburn system in romanization. I've flipped the chart a little bit, so now this is the agyo, this is the kagyo, this is the gagyo, etc. And once again, we have these syllables that have 3 letters, 3 letters, 3 letters. And then on this chart, we also have combination sounds. Kya, kyu, kyo, gya, gyu, gyo, etc. And another thing that's added to this chart are voiced sounds. So instead of just saying ka, sa, we have ka, and then we have ga. Okay? Likewise, sa plus za. Let me go back one more slide. In this original chart, the Goju Onzu, notice none of those voiced consonants get a separate column. And if we go even further simply back and look at it this way, there's no voiced columns and there's no combination sound columns. So when we're talking about the Goju Onzu, we're really talking about the basic building blocks of the language. But this is how Japanese is organized. Okay. So here's some examples from real life of romanization in Japan according to the Hepburn system. This is Shimbashi Station. Kamishiro, to the left is Minami Kamishiro. Matsudo in Tokyo. Now let's look at the Kunene system. Same chart, same idea. We've got the agyo, the kagyo, the sagyo, the adan, the idan, etc. But now you'll notice that there's a few differences. That chi is now written with a ti and not a chi. Shi is written si, not shi. Tsu is written tu, not tsu. Why is that? Well, remember what I said, the Kunde system is based on how something is spelled. And the Japanese think of the Tagyo family of kana as being all of one family. Even though we can hear the difference between ta and chi, that consonant sound is really quite different, t and ch. But in the Goju Onzu, these are one family. And so consequently, when it gets romanized, they use the same consonant. Likewise, there's a big difference between s and sh here in sa and shi. But because they're in the same gyo, the same column, they're in the same family. And so consequently, they use that same consonant. Here's the Kunde Shiki in the same kind of chart with the added voiced rows and also the combination sounds. And here's some examples from real life of what that looks like. Kuroishi. So instead of SHI, we have SI. It's not a typo, it's just a different romanization system. And to the left of this train station, Sakai Matsu. So it's not TSU, but TU. Likewise, Katsura in that system is spelled Katura, not Katsura. And here we see a bus that's headed for the Machida terminal, MATI, not MACHI. So the Hepburn and the Kunde systems, what's the difference? The Hepburn is by far the dominant system. And so that's the one that I'm going to focus on today. The remainder of our course materials in this lesson and in other lessons, if we're using romanization, we'll assume that you're using the Hepburn system. And indeed, when you do the homework, I specify I want you to do part of it a little bit in the Kunde system, but most of it in the Hepburn system. Most librarians use the Hepburn system, so if you're looking for books that have been cataloged and you're typing in something, a title by romanization, then you'll probably want to use the Hepburn system, at least as a first try. The one thing I do want to mention, though, and I mentioned this once before in the unit on word processing, is that in Microsoft Word, you can use either system, the Hepburn system or the Kunde system, as you're typing. So if you type CHI, you'll get the kana chi. But if you type in TI, you'll also get it. Okay, so now we're going to move forward only looking at the Hepburn system. I'm not going to be talking about the Kunde system or any other system that you may be familiar with from other textbooks. I'm going to start with macrons, long vowels. Macrons, lines over vowels, which I already taught you how to input into a document in the word processing unit. Those are commonly used to represent long vowels today. So here I have kou, and it's written K with an O and a macron over it. Okay, ku likewise is romanized K with a U and a macron over it. Now, this all is possible because of the wonders of electronics and Unicode in particular. But before the age of Unicode and before the age of digital word processing, in a more sophisticated environment, there were other methods. And so if you're looking at older materials, you may see something like this. Sometimes long vowels are represented by circumflexes, which kind of looks, some people say, like a little hat over the vowel. As I mentioned once before, that tends to be a sign that somebody was word processing using a Mac and not a PC, and probably doing it in the 1990s or maybe early 21st century. Eventually, Macs also became capable of inputting macrons. Linguistically, a circumflex really isn't the right thing to put over a vowel, and so I would discourage you from doing that. Some linguists use doubled letters, UU, OO, or OU. That's a specialized field in linguistics. Again, I wouldn't recommend that you make it a habit to romanize like that. The one place where that type of long vowel is important is in Jim Breen's dictionary. So if you're entering a long vowel in Jim Breen's, you have to do it like this. A long O is OU. not O with a macron. His dictionary won't recognize macrons. Another thing that you might see is a long vowel might be represented by an added H at the end. So for example, this character, this kanji pronounced no, is often written N-O-H instead of N-O with a macron over it. Or this surname, Sato, very common surname, is sometimes romanized S-A-T-O-H instead of S-A-T-O with a macron over it. Note that there's no differentiation in romanization between O and OU in romanization of place names and things like that. So Oki is written O with a macron, K-I-I. But if you're writing the furigana, for example, of Oki, you don't write O-U-ki, you write O-O-ki. O-U, king, the kanji for king, is written with an O and a macron. So it looks the same here as it does here, but in the kana we see that there is a difference. Toru, to pass through, to go, is written like this. And toi, far away, which in the kana, it's also you use an O, not an U, is written toi. This word, toi, as in a position or a rank, looks different. In the kana, we have toi, but look, in the romanization, it's the same. So keep that in mind. Be very careful with ei. It's romanized ei in the Hepburn system. It is not romanized ee. I cannot tell you how many students I have seen who romanize the word sensei, S-E-N-S-E-E. I know why that happens, because one of the major textbooks for Japanese as a second language does that, but that is not standard Hepburn system romanization. It's a bad habit to get into. You shouldn't be in it. A long E or I or A is pretty unusual in Japanese. It does happen, but it's kind of unusual. So you probably won't have to romanize them very often. If you do need to romanize them, you have a choice. You can put it in as a double vowel like this, or you could put it in as a vowel with a macron over it. Either one is acceptable, but of course you should always be consistent. Let's move on to capitalization. Of course, Japanese doesn't have capitalization. Japanese never have to think about that. But if you're romanizing and you're writing in English, you do have to consider it. So here are the rules. Proper nouns, people's names, place names, should be capitalized, just as they are in English. Likewise, the first word in a sentence, like in English, should be capitalized. An exception is poetry. Usually poetry, the first word in the poem isn't. Proper titles, when they're part of an address, should be capitalized. So Tanaka Sensei, in the name Tanaka Sensei, the T is capitalized and the S is capitalized. However, in a book title, and this is different than what we standardly do in English, only the two categories above of proper nouns and proper titles are capitalized. How about spacing? There's no real solid rule for this. It does differ from system to system, use to use, but generally speaking, the words are separated from each other and from particles. So if you have the particle kara and then the particle made, for example, those would sit separately from the words that they're modifying. Some particles, when strung together, get no space between them. So demo, which some people actually think of it as its own unit, not just de and mo, but demo. Nite, something that's a particle you may not be familiar with. It's seen more in older texts. toshite, etc. So when those get romanized, they get squished together. Let me give you some examples. Here's a sentence. Watashi wa gakusei desu. Watashi is one single word, and then you got a space. The particle wa sits separately, plus a space. Gakusei is one unit, one word, and then another space, and desu. その人でも行けない。その人でも行かない. Here we have the spaces. But these two particles have been squished together. This one didn't fit on one line. Sensei として参加しました. Sensei space としてスペース参加スペースしました.彼の母はアメリカ人です. 彼スペースのスペース母スペースはスペースアメリカ人. I'm going to come to hyphens in just a minute. Space des. Okay, let's do names. Give Japanese names in Japanese order, the surname first and the given name second. Unless the work that you're citing is published in English, in which case you should put a comma between the names. If they're in Japanese order and the work is published in Japanese, you don't need the comma. As I just said, if the author has some sort of odd or idiosyncratic way of romanizing his or her name, you kind of have to stick with it no matter how much you hate it. So for example, the manga artist Naito Yasuhiro writes his name Nightow. Go figure. It was his choice, his name, he gets to do it that way. You shouldn't change it to Nait with an O and a macron. If it's a commonplace name like Tokyo, then you can leave the macrons off. Tokyo, Osaka, for example, and Kyoto are usually names that don't get macrons on them. However, other city names, you should have macrons over long vowels. How about hyphens? We were just looking at a hyphen. Hyphens are used with prefixes or suffixes, but there isn't a hard and fast rule. So I'm giving you a few examples here. Teki, as in something that's like something. Tensai teki. Gaku, jinrui gaku, some sort of academic discipline. Ron, shinka ron. Ka, kindai ka. Oh, there's a typo there. My apologies. That ka should be this ka. Den, eiyu den. Shu, mondai shu. Shi, sekai shi. Sha, shinchou sha. This one is particularly tricky. I've seen a lot of people romanize company without the hyphen there. You can also use hyphens for honorific suffixes, such as san, Suzuki-san. If the suffix has more than one syllable, you should separate it by a space and not a hyphen. So, for example, Tanaka Bucho, as in Mr. Tanaka, the manager of the division. And instead of saying Tanaka hyphen san here, we say Tanaka space Bucho. Hyphens can also be used in geographic units, like a prefecture or a ward. So here's an example. Oita-ken is Oita-ken. Oita prefecture. Shinagawa-ku, Shinagawa-ku, Shinagawa ward. Nagasaki-shi, Nagasaki-shi, the city of Nagasaki. What about formatting in romanization? Generally speaking, even though Microsoft Word will let you do it, you should avoid bold and italics in Japanese script. You should use italics, however, in romanization as you would in English. So here's an example. Natsume Soseki wrote a novel titled Kokoro. So see how I have italicized Kokoro because it's the title in romanization. But then when I wrote the title in Japanese, I did not italicize the kana. If you're romanizing a poem, you've got a couple choices. You can insert a forward slash at the line breaks instead of formatting them in. So, for example, Furuike ya kawazu no tobikomu mizu no oto. This is a famous poem by Basho. And if I were putting this in a footnote, I'd probably opt for this kind of formatting because it would keep my footnote relatively physically small. Once you start putting in hard returns at the end of each line, then the footnote grows in length and kind of screws up the formatting or looks awkward at the bottom of the page. Onbin. A lot of people don't even know what onbin is, so let me first describe what that is. Onbin is usually translated as a euphonic change. And so an onbin, think of it, on is sound and bin is convenient here. So it's a sound change that happens for convenience sake, something that's easier to say in some particular way. For example, n, that kana n, is sometimes pronounced not as an N, but as an M, as in mother. For example, in the word shimbun, we don't say shinbun, we say shimbun with an M sound. Likewise, genmai, brown rice, is not genmai, because genmai is kind of hard to say. It's a lot easier to say genmai. In the cases like this, you have a choice in romanization. A more conservative choice is to use an N, but there are many people who will use an M. So for example, shinbun could be written S-H-I-N-B-U-N or S-H-I-M-B-U-N. Likewise, genmai could be G-E-N-M-A-I or it could be G-E-M-M-A-I, either way. Keep in mind that you don't want to do a double N like you would be if you were word processing. That wouldn't make any sense. Likewise, a small tsu in romanization is a little bit unusual. A small tsu, as you know, changes from a large tsu. It's very different. A small tsu increases, if you will, the consonant in a word. So this word is pronounced katta. It's not pronounced katsuta, it's pronounced katta. And this becomes, in romanization, K-A-T-T-A. Or this word, kokkai, is K-O-K-K-A-I. But when that small tsu precedes a CH sound, it's a little bit more difficult. The romanization is TCH, it's not CH-CH. So this is mitchaku, M-I-T, C-H-A-K-U. And this is netchu, N-E-T-C-H-U. Sort of a little bit of connection back to that goju onzu idea of it being in the tagyo. What about apostrophes? Once in a while you'll see an apostrophe in romanization. It's not too common in Japanese, but it does show up. If your word could be confused for another word in romanization, sometimes an apostrophe is appropriate. So for example, we have this word kin-yu, and that's certainly not the same as this word ki-nyu. You see the difference? This is kin-yu. This is ki-nyu. If we didn't have an apostrophe there, the two words would look identical in romanization. This situation usually happens when there's an n sound in one of the words. In that case, you should place the apostrophe after the n to distinguish it as part of the earlier syllable and not the later one. You may also find that you want to use an apostrophe in the case of a word that combines two vowels. Here's a word that we saw earlier when we were looking at onyomi and kunyomi. The word is go-on, one of the different kinds of on-yomi. And that's usually romanized go apostrophe on, because if you didn't do it that way, it would look like this, which a native English speaker is really tempted to pronounce goon, and that's just not what it is. How about particles? Well, we've got 3 particles that are romanized in a way that is not necessarily intuitive. O, the direct object marker, should be romanized O. Now, if you were looking at the Goju Onzu, you might think that it should be romanized WO. Or if you're thinking about how you type it in when you're word processing, you might think it should be romanized WO. But remember, the Hepburn system is based on how something sounds, not how it's spelled. And so in the Hepburn system, the O is romanized with just an O. Likewise, the particle wa, when it's a particle, is romanized WA, not HA. And as in gakkoe ikimasu, when it's used as a particle, a directional particle, should be romanized not HE. Almost all academic journals have some kind of style sheet, and if you're actually submitting something to an academic journal, you should consult that style sheet before you put the whole manuscript together. Let's take a look at the Journal of Japanese Studies as an example. They have their own style sheet online. They tell you what citation style they want you to use. They tell you when you're using Japanese that you should use a macron, that you should follow the Hepburn system of romanization. I realize this might be a little bit difficult to see because it's so small. And they also tell you that they want specific spelling and punctuation. Now, this is the Journal of Japanese Studies. The Journal of Asian Studies might be a little bit different. Each journal has its own set, its own style set. As a practical application, when you're searching a database, especially one that doesn't accept kanji, like Minerva, you should try more than one romanization if you don't find what you want the first time. It's perfectly possible that a librarian, when he or she was cataloging the work that you're looking for, decided to put in a hyphen where you wouldn't have, or put in a space where you wouldn't have, or to represent a long vowel in a way that you haven't done. Particularly in Minerva, I try not to even put in long vowels per se. It rubs me the wrong way to do it, but often I find that's how the books have been cataloged. So you have to be really persistent when you're searching for materials using romanization. You cannot assume that the librarian who cataloged that particular work was thinking along the same lines as you were. If you want additional information about romanization, the American Library Association has its own style sheet about romanization for librarians. There's a link to it on the Blackboard website, and there's also a link here. It's quite a long document. It's 13 pages long. It covers most of what we already took a look at. So that's our basic information about romanization.